When Steffi Forrester decided to extend a professional opportunity to Dylan, she told herself that the choice was rooted in logic rather than emotion. In business sense rather than personal bias. Forrester Creations had always prided itself on recognizing talent where others saw risk. And Dylan, despite the controversy surrounding her presence in the Spencer orbit, possessed a quiet determination that could not be ignored. Yet Steffi was not blind to the tension this decision would create. She knew Elektra's objections were not merely personal insecurity but a visceral reaction born of instinct, a sense that Dylan's proximity to Will carried consequences far beyond office walls. Still, Steffi moved forward, convinced that control was better than avoidance, and that by placing Dylan within the structured environment of Forrester Creations, she could contain whatever threat Elektra feared. It was a calculated gamble, one that underestimated the volatility of human emotion. Elektra's resistance to Dylan's appointment was immediate and unmistakable. To her, the decision felt less like a professional endorsement and more like a dismissal of her concerns. As though her unease had been quietly categorized as jealousy rather than intuition. The sense of being unheard gnawed at her, planting a seed of resentment that would grow steadily in the days to come. Yet Elektra was forced to compartmentalize that frustration when she and RJ departed on a business trip, a commitment she could not abandon without appearing unprofessional or insecure. The irony was cruel. The very trip meant to advance her career created the space Dylan needed, removing the final barrier between her and Will. In Elektra's absence, the atmosphere around Will shifted almost imperceptibly at first. Dylan did not rush or demand, she understood the value of patience. She allowed familiarity to deepen naturally. Through shared moments that seemed harmless in isolation, conversations lingered longer than necessary. Silences became comfortable rather than awkward. Dylan framed her presence as support, as gratitude for Will's earlier kindness, carefully blurring the line between appreciation and emotional reliance. Will, already inclined toward empathy, found himself responding without fully recognizing the shift. He believed he was being loyal simply by resisting overt temptation, unaware that loyalty erodes long before it collapses. Dylan's strategy was not one of seduction but of emotional alignment. She listened intently, remembered small details, positioned herself as someone who understood Will without expectation. The absence of Elektra created a vacuum Dylan instinctively filled, offering reassurance without judgment, warmth without demands. For Will, this dynamic was deeply unsettling precisely because it felt effortless. He did not seek Dylan's closeness, yet he did not push it away either. The familiarity grew quietly, slipping past his defenses under the guise of normalcy. The moment Dylan chose to confess her feelings did not come impulsively. It arrived after careful observation, after sensing Will's internal conflict and recognizing the hesitation that lingered behind his polite restraint. Her confession was not dramatic or manipulative, but raw in its honesty. She spoke of admiration that had deepened into something more profound, of gratitude that had transformed into affection she could no longer contain. For Will, the revelation landed like a shockwave. It forced him to confront a truth he had avoided acknowledging, that Dylan's presence had already changed him. Will's reaction was not immediate rejection, nor was it acceptance. It was confusion, layered with guilt and a growing sense of responsibility. He felt torn between the loyalty he owed Elektra and the unexpected connection Dylan had cultivated. The conflict was not rooted in desire alone, but in identity. Will had always seen himself as someone who did the right thing, who protected rather than betrayed. Now he faced the unsettling realization that doing nothing could itself be a form of betrayal. That allowing ambiguity to persist might hurt everyone involved. As Will struggled to reconcile his emotions, Elektra's return loomed unexpectedly. Her arrival disrupted the fragile balance Dylan had carefully built, reintroducing a presence that immediately altered the emotional temperature of the room. Elektra sensed the change before it was explained, reading it in the way Will hesitated, in the subtle tension that clung to Dylan's posture. Years of navigating complicated relationships had sharpened Elektra's intuition, and it did not fail her now. Something had happened, or at the very least, something had begun. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, fueled by accumulated fear, frustration, and unspoken truths. Elektra demanded clarity, refusing to accept reassurances that rang hollow against the evidence of emotional distance. Dylan, no longer able to retreat into ambiguity, stood by her confession, unwilling to deny the feelings she had claimed. Will found himself caught between them, each word he spoke threatening to wound someone he cared about. The argument was not explosive but devastating in its honesty, exposing vulnerabilities Elektra and Will had long tried to shield from one another. For Elektra, the confrontation confirmed her deepest fears. Even if Will had not physically betrayed her, the emotional breach felt just as real. Trust, once cracked, does not require infidelity to collapse. The realization that her absence had created space for another woman to matter so deeply shook her sense of security, forcing her to question whether her relationship with Will had been as stable as she believed. Anger mingled with grief, creating a pain that was difficult to articulate yet impossible to ignore. Will, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his indecision. His attempt to spare everyone pain had only magnified it. He could no longer claim innocence. Not after allowing Dylan's feelings to grow unchecked. Not after failing to set boundaries when they mattered most. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on him, leaving him uncertain of how to repair what had been damaged, or whether repair was even possible. The fallout from Dylan's actions rippled outward, destabilizing more than just one relationship. Tension spread through interconnected circles, altering dynamics that had once felt secure. Dylan herself was left grappling with the consequences of her honesty, questioning whether speaking her truth had been an act of courage or selfishness. Steffi's decision, once framed as a strategic move, now carried unintended emotional costs, complicating her sense of control over the situation. As Will and Electra stood on the edge of collapse, the future of their relationship became uncertain. The test they faced was not merely about fidelity, but about whether trust could survive emotional intrusion, whether love could withstand the realization that it was vulnerable to circumstance. Around them, other relationships wavered, influenced by the same currents of doubt and desire. In the end, the situation left no clear villains, only flawed individuals navigating emotions more powerful than intention. The consequences of Dylan's presence would not fade quickly, lingering in glances, silences, and choices yet to be made. What remained was a landscape reshaped by tension, where every connection felt more fragile, and every decision carried the weight of what had already been lost. In this world, stability is never guaranteed, and love, once tested, is never the same again. Whispers surrounding the latest developments on The Bold and the Beautiful have ignited a familiar, yet intoxicating question among viewers. One that cuts to the heart of the show's enduring appeal. Who will betray their lover first? It is a question steeped not merely in curiosity, but in anticipation, because betrayal in this world is never random. It is emotional, deliberate, and almost always born from fear rather than desire. As the spotlight shifts toward two parallel relationships, Electra and Will and Dylan, the narrative begins to pulse with a sense of inevitability, as though the story itself is inching toward a fracture it can no longer delay. At the center of this emotional web stands Will Spencer, a young man shaped by a family history that prizes charm and instinct over decisiveness. When Will discovers that Dylan has been living out of her car, the moment feels less like a plot device and more like a moral test. One that exposes the quiet vulnerabilities beneath his confidence. Offering Dylan a place to stay is framed as compassion, an act of generosity that aligns with the image Will has of himself as someone who helps rather than abandons. Yet even in that choice, there is an unspoken tension. Compassion, in this world, rarely remains pure. It has a way of blurring boundaries, especially when proximity replaces distance and gratitude begins to resemble intimacy. Dylan's presence in Will's orbit intensifies as she edges closer to a professional opportunity at Forrester Creations. The possibility of her working there is more than a career move. It is a structural shift in the emotional architecture of Will's life. Suddenly, Dylan is no longer a temporary guest or a passing concern. She becomes part of his daily rhythm, his environment, his unguarded moments. Though Dylan insists, both to herself and to others, that she poses no threat to Will's relationship with Electra, intention does not always dictate outcome. Vulnerability has its own gravity, and Dylan's quiet resilience, combined with her dependence on Will's kindness, creates a bond that does not need romance to become dangerous. Electra senses this long before anything tangible occurs. Her unease does not stem from evidence, but from instinct, that subtle awareness that something is shifting beyond her control. Watching Will grow increasingly involved in Dylan's life triggers insecurities Electra has long tried to suppress. She begins to question not only Dylan's intentions but her own place in Will's heart. In a world where love is constantly tested by circumstance, Electra's confidence starts to erode, replaced by suspicion that feels both irrational and unavoidable. These doubts gnaw at her, creating emotional fractures that widen with every misunderstood glance or half-heard conversation. Even moments that should reassure her instead feel ambiguous, leaving Electra trapped in a cycle of self-interrogation. She wants to trust Will, yet trust requires certainty, and certainty is precisely what she lacks. Her fear is not that Will has already betrayed her, but that he might, and that possibility alone becomes enough to destabilize her sense of security. It is within this fragile emotional state that RJ enters the picture. Not as a calculated temptation, but as an unexpected refuge. From their earliest scenes together, the chemistry between Elektra and RJ is undeniable, charged with a warmth that feels instinctive rather than forced. RJ's playful gesture of removing Elektra's necklace, joking about guarding her heart, carries symbolic weight. It suggests awareness, care, and a kind of emotional attunement that contrasts sharply with Elektra's growing uncertainty around Will. In that moment, the narrative plants a quiet but unmistakable seed, that perhaps Elektra and RJ are not merely crossing paths, but circling one another with unresolved intent. As Elektra's anxiety about Dylan deepens, her interactions with RJ take on new significance. What once felt like harmless connection begins to feel like escape. RJ becomes the person who listens without questioning, who offers reassurance without demanding explanation. In his presence, Elektra is not required to defend her jealousy or rationalize her fear. She is simply understood. That emotional safety, especially when contrasted with the instability she feels in her relationship with Will, becomes intoxicating. The tragedy of the situation lies in how easily misunderstanding can masquerade as truth. It is entirely possible for Elektra to witness something, an embrace taken out of context, a private conversation misinterpreted, that confirms her worst fears without actually reflecting reality. In a state of emotional exhaustion, she may choose flight over confrontation, retreating before she has all the facts. That choice, fueled by pain rather than evidence, sets the stage for irreversible consequences. Seeking comfort, Elektra may turn fully toward RJ, allowing the emotional closeness between them to cross a line she never intended to approach. A kiss born from vulnerability, or even a single night driven by longing and confusion, would not be framed as malice but as surrender. The aftermath of such a moment could splinter into regret if Elektra later realizes her assumptions about Will and Dylan were unfounded. Yet the damage once done cannot be undone. Betrayal does not require permanence, it only requires a moment where restraint fails. Still, the narrative refuses to paint Elektra as the sole potential transgressor. The men in the Spencer lineage are notorious for their wavering resolve, and Will is no exception. Dylan's growing dependence, combined with her proximity and gratitude, could awaken feelings Will is not prepared to confront. Temptation, in this context, is not overt seduction but emotional accessibility. Will may find himself drawn to Dylan not because he seeks to betray Elektra, but because he feels needed in a way that affirms his identity. Similarly, RJ's attraction to Elektra is unlikely to remain passive. His awareness of her vulnerability, paired with his own desire, may push him to pursue her actively, convinced that what they share is not merely circumstance but destiny delayed. In such a scenario, betrayal becomes less about moral failure and more about emotional momentum, the slow accumulation of choices that lead characters to cross lines they once believed inviolable. What gives this unfolding quadrangle its dramatic potency is the inevitability of rupture. A love story involving four emotionally exposed individuals cannot sustain itself without fracture. One betrayal, or perhaps two, feels not only possible but necessary to propel the narrative forward. The real tension lies not in whether someone will cheat, but in who will do so first, and under what emotional justification. Whether it is Elektra seeking solace too soon, Will succumbing to temptation too quietly, or RJ acting on feelings he can no longer suppress. The coming betrayal will not merely end a relationship. It will redefine loyalties, expose buried insecurities, and force each character to confront the truth about what they want versus what they fear losing. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, love rarely ends cleanly. It fractures, overlaps, and re-emerges in new forms, shaped by regret and desire in equal measure. As this story moves toward its next chapter, the audience is left with a tantalizing uncertainty. The betrayal that seems inevitable has not yet occurred, but its shadow already looms large, stretching across every glance, every hesitation, every unspoken doubt. When it finally happens, it will not feel shocking so much as tragically earned, a reminder that in matters of the heart, restraint is often the first casualty of fear.